I just wanted a glass of water, son. She hid my cane. The parrot Loro's sharp cry echoed through the mansion's empty dining room, freezing Ricardo in place. It wasn't Loro's usual raspy voice, but a perfect imitation of his father's weak, pleading tone, a sound he hadn't heard in months. A chilling shiver ran down his spine. What did the parrot mean? And what was truly happening in his father's isolated room, in the service wing, which Sophia, his wife, insisted on keeping out of his sight? What he was about to discover would shake the foundations of his business empire and his own family forever. Ricardo felt his blood run cold, a chill spreading through every fiber of his being. The sound, so vivid, so painful, seemed to pierce the barrier of his complacency. Loro was just a parrot, a pet that, with its peculiar intelligence, repeated what it heard. But that voice, it was his father's fragile voice, a voice he barely remembered, stifled by months of silence and distance. He turned abruptly to Loro, who was perched on his golden stand, head tilted, black eyes fixed on Ricardo with an unusual, almost human intensity. "Loro, what was that?" Ricardo murmured, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper of disbelief. The parrot merely blinked slowly, then ruffled its feathers and began to whistle a cheerful tune, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if the anguish it had just uttered was merely a jest. Ricardo tried to convince himself it was just an unfortunate coincidence, an echo of some old conversation the bird had picked up. After all, his father had Alzheimer's, and Sophia always said he had delusions, that he complained about things that didn't exist, that his mind betrayed him. She insisted it was for the elderly man's well-being, for his peace. Still, the image of his father, debilitated and isolated, gnawed at him with a sharp pang of guilt. How long had it been since he'd spent quality time, real time, with his father? The business, the trips, the endless meetings. Everything seemed more urgent, more important. Sophia had taken on the responsibility with a dedication Ricardo deeply admired, or at least thought he admired. She always said with calculated sweetness, "It's better for his peace, Ricardo. He gets confused with too many people and noise, and the room downstairs is quiet, away from the hustle and bustle of the main house." And Ricardo, blindly trusting his wife, accepted, relieved not to have to deal with the difficult reality of his father's illness. At that moment, however, Sophia's justification sounded hollow, devoid of any warmth. A small knot of discomfort began to tighten in his chest, a chilling sensation infiltrating his soul. He approached Loro, extending his hand slowly. The parrot, instead of nestling on his finger as usual, recoiled slightly, letting out a low, almost inaudible moan that sounded strangely familiar. It wasn't Loro's moan, but a perfect imitation of a human lament, full of sadness and weariness, a moan of helplessness. Ricardo felt a shiver run down his spine. The hairs on his arms stood on end, and a dark premonition enveloped him. "Ricardo, darling, is everything all right?" Sophia's soft, melodic voice filled the room, breaking the tense silence. She entered, dressed in an elegant pearl-colored silk robe, her blonde hair perfectly styled even at that hour of the morning. Her blue eyes, usually so warm and welcoming, seemed a little colder, almost calculating today. "You look pale. Is Loro up to his senseless imitations again?" Ricardo forced a smile, trying to disguise the turmoil within him. No, just Loro is a bit agitated today. I think he misses you." He tried to deflect, but Sophia's penetrating gaze fixed on the parrot, which was now completely silent, merely observing the scene with a disturbing intelligence. "Oh, Loro has always been a strange creature, hasn't he?" Sophia said with a tone of slight disdain, a forced smile on her lips. "Don't listen to him, Ricardo. He repeats anything nonsensical. Remember the time he imitated the fire alarm for hours on end, driving us crazy?" She laughed, a crystalline sound that didn't reach Ricardo's eyes, which were fixed on the service wing door. Speaking of important matters, the meeting with the investors has been rescheduled for 10. You need to be sharp and focused. She approached, kissing him on the cheek with a quick gesture, but Ricardo felt an invisible, cold barrier between them. His mind was far away, still echoing the parrot's words. She hid my cane, she didn't give me water. Could it be true? The idea was absurd, revolting. Sophia, his Sophia, so dedicated, so attentive, so perfect in everything. But the moan, the lament of helplessness. It was as if the parrot was trying to tell him something urgent, something vital, something his mind refused to accept. But his heart was already beginning to sense. He looked at the door leading to the service wing, where his father was. A solid wooden door, always closed, always silent, a symbol of the distance he had allowed to grow. Sophia always assured him that the room was comfortable, that there were nurses and everything his father needed. But what if it wasn't? What if the parrot, in its animal innocence, was revealing a cruel truth that he, in his voluntary blindness, had ignored? An unbearable weight of guilt began to form in his stomach, mixed with a chilling fear. He had to know, he had to see with his own eyes. The doubt, once a tiny seed, now sprouted forcefully, threatening to tear apart the fabric of his comfortable reality and his carefully constructed life. Sophia, noticing Ricardo's distraction, gave him one last forced smile. "Well, darling, I need to get ready for lunch with the ladies of the club. Don't forget your meeting. Take care." With a graceful nod, she turned and left the dining room, her silk robe fluttering slightly, leaving a trail of floral perfume. The door closed softly, but for Ricardo, the silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the echo of Lauro's words. He stood there, motionless, his coffee cooling in the untouched cup. The parrot, still on its perch, seemed to observe him with an unusual gravity, as if expecting something. "She hid my cane. She didn't give me water." The phrases repeated in his mind, now with the disturbing clarity of an accusation. It was no longer a jest, no longer a coincidence. It was a call, a cry for help that he, in his blindness and selfishness, had ignored for so long. A wave of nausea rose in his throat. How could he have been so negligent, so absorbed in his world of numbers and technology that he delegated the care of his own father, the man who taught him to dream and to fight, to a woman who now seemed so strange, so distant? The image of his father, once a strong and vibrant man, now merged with the fragility of the voice imitated by Lauro. The isolated room, the peace Sophia so defended, suddenly seemed like a prison. The weight of guilt was overwhelming. He had trusted blindly, handing over the most sacred responsibility, his father's well-being, into Sophia's hands, without ever questioning, without ever checking. The convenience of not having to deal with illness, with old age, with decay, had been a comfortable veil, but now that veil was being torn apart by a parrot. With a deep sigh that seemed to tear the air from his lungs, Ricardo stood up. His steps were heavy, each one laden with the urgency of a truth that needed to be uncovered. He could no longer wait. He could no longer hide behind Sophia's excuses or his own busy schedule. The mansion, once a refuge of luxury and tranquility, now seemed like a labyrinth, and the only way out was through that door in the service wing. He walked down the main corridor, the cold marble under his feet, sunlight filtering through the wide windows, illuminating expensive artworks and sumptuous furniture. But none of that mattered now. His gaze was fixed on the small, almost hidden solid wooden door that led to the service wing. It was a door he rarely noticed, a portal to a world he had allowed to be forgotten. As he approached, the air seemed to grow denser, colder. The silence was different from the silence of the main house. It was a heavy, almost oppressive silence, devoid of the usual bustle of servants or Lauro's singing. The door looked older, its paint peeling in places, a stark contrast to the impeccable rest of the mansion. Ricardo reached out, hesitating for an instant. His heart pounded in his chest, a drum of apprehension and fear. What would he find there? The truth, however painful, was necessary. He turned the doorknob. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open slowly, and a soft creak broke the silence. A peculiar smell, a mixture of mold and something indefinable, hit his nostrils, making him recoil slightly. It was an odor that spoke of abandonment, of forgotten things. Light was scarce, and darkness seemed to swallow the narrow corridor ahead, a grim invitation to the truth. He took the first step inside, into the unknown, into the truth Lauro had revealed, feeling the weight of every moment of his negligence. Ricardo took the first step into the service corridor. The smell was nauseating. Stagnant dampness, cheap disinfectant, and abandonment. Light barely penetrated. Weak bulbs cast distorted shadows on the suspended dust. The silence was heavy, oppressive, a silence of absence, of hushed voices, of suffocated life. Each step echoed on the cold, worn floor, amplifying the frantic beat of his heart. He passed by half-open doors, revealing cluttered and dusty rooms, a stark contrast to the impeccable mansion. Stained, peeling walls, cobwebs in the corners. No nurse, no sign of the promised care. The peace for his father seemed, with every meter, a cruel lie. Guilt tightened in his chest, a physical pain. How could he have been so blind, so absorbed in his own business world, that he failed to notice what was under his own roof? Lauro's phrases, "She hid my cane," "She didn't give me water," resonated in his mind, now with a deafening clarity. He reached the last door in the corridor, simple dark wood unadorned. No plaque indicated that his father resided there. The doorknob was slightly rusted, and the door seemed slightly ajar, inviting revelation. Ricardo hesitated, his hand hovering over the cold doorknob. The fear of what he would find was almost paralyzing, but the urgency of the truth was even greater. He pushed the door open carefully. A soft creak broke the oppressive silence. The room was dark, heavy curtains blocking almost all sunlight. The air was dense, impregnated with the smell of mold, abandonment, and something else, something he didn't want to identify. His eyes took a moment to adjust to the gloom. What he saw made his stomach churn with nausea. The room was small and Spartan, with peeling walls and a dirty linoleum floor. There was a simple, single bed with crumpled, faded sheets, and a small bedside table with an empty, dusty glass. There were no photos, no books, no personal objects. It was a place devoid of life, of affection, of humanity. And then he saw him, his father, curled up in bed, covered by a thin, torn blanket, looking tiny and fragile. His face was turned to the wall, but Ricardo could see the thinness of his arms, the pale, wrinkled skin. A shiver of horror ran through Ricardo, mixed with a searing pain. That was not peace. That was negligence, cruelty. Sophia's words, her excuses, her promises, all fell apart. The image of the elegant, smiling woman transformed into something monstrous and deceitful. Lauro wasn't up to mischief. Lauro was revealing the darkest, most painful truth of his life. Ricardo felt his knees buckle. A cold fury bubbled up, a rage never before experienced, mixed with overwhelming shame. He had failed, miserably, with his father. He approached the bed, his heart beating like a drum. "Father," he whispered, his voice choked. His father didn't move. Ricardo extended a trembling hand, touching the thin shoulder of the man who had once been his hero. The skin was cold and dry to the touch, an undeniable sign of suffering. Ricardo touched his father's shoulder again, more firmly, but with the delicacy of someone who fears breaking something precious and fragile. "Father, it's me, Ricardo," he said, his voice now a little louder, but still laden with a deep emotion he could barely control. The body under the blanket trembled slightly. Slowly, with visible effort, his father turned his head, revealing a face Ricardo barely recognized. His eyes, once full of life and sagacity, were sunken and opaque, with a distant, almost lost glimmer. His unshaven beard was long and disheveled, and his lips were cracked and dry. An open, poorly healed wound at the corner of his mouth caught Ricardo's attention, causing a lump in his throat. It was an image of desolation that cruelly contrasted with the opulent luxury of the rest of the mansion. "Son." The word came out in a hoarse, almost inaudible whisper, a thread of a voice that seemed to come from very far away. A faint, fleeting flicker of recognition passed through his father's eyes, but was soon replaced by painful confusion. He tried to lift his hand, but the weakness was evident, and his arm fell heavily back onto the bed. Ricardo held his father's hand, feeling the rough skin and protruding bones. It was the hand that had guided him through so many moments, that had taught him to fish and to fix things. Now it was so weak, so helpless. His eyes swept the room again, searching for evidence, but everything there was already irrefutable proof. The dusty glass on the bedside table, the absence of any water bottle, the lack of a cane in sight. Laura's words echoed with brutal force. "She hid my cane. She didn't give me water." It wasn't delirium, it was the truth, the cruel and undeniable truth that tore at his soul. Ricardo felt a wave of cold fury rise up his spine, mixed with such intense shame that it made him want to scream. How could he have allowed this? How could he have been so blind, so absorbed in his own life of business and conveniences that he didn't see his own father's suffering? The image of Sophia, with her sweet smile and well-crafted excuses, transformed into a nightmare. She wasn't the dedicated wife he thought. She was an executioner, a liar who exploited the vulnerability of an elderly man. He knelt beside the bed, his forehead resting on his father's cold hand. Tears, long held back, began to flow freely, hot and painful, wetting the wrinkled skin. "Forgive me, Father. Forgive me for not seeing, for not taking care of you," he murmured, his voice choked with pain and guilt. His father merely looked at him, eyes half closed, perhaps not fully understanding the words, but perhaps feeling the warmth of that touch, that presence after so long of abandonment. It was a bond re-establishing itself, even in the darkness. Ricardo raised his head, determination hardening his features. The pain and guilt would not paralyze him. They would propel him to act with urgency. He couldn't reverse time, but he could act now. His father needed him. He needed water, food, medical care, affection, dignity. He needed to be rescued from that captivity disguised as peace. He stood up, muscles tense, his heart pounding with a mixture of love and anger. He looked at his father, who now seemed to have fallen asleep again, exhausted by the small effort. "I will take care of you, Father, I promise," Ricardo said, his voice firm, full of a new and fierce resolve. He knew what he had to do. First, ensure his father was safe and received the best care. Then confront Sophia. Justice would be served. There would be no more blindness, no more excuses. The mansion, once the stage of his complacency, would now be the setting for a painful but necessary redemption. He left the room, closing the door softly, but not before casting one last look at his father, promising in his heart that he would never leave him alone again. Ricardo left his father's room, the promise etched into every fiber of his being. There was no time for laments, only for action. With his heart ablaze and his mind in a whirlwind, he grabbed his phone. The first call was to Dr. Elias, the family doctor, a man he trusted. "Doctor, I need you to come to the mansion now. It's a serious emergency with my father." "Urgent," Ricardo said, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. The seriousness in Ricardo's tone alarmed the doctor, who promised to arrive in a few minutes. While waiting, Ricardo called Anna, his personal assistant, known for her efficiency. Anna, organize a team of elite private nurses, experienced in geriatrics and Alzheimer's, to come immediately, and prepare a room on the main floor, as comfortable and welcoming as possible for my father. No expense spared, Anna. I want the best now. Ricardo's voice was an unquestionable order, but also a lament, an echo of his guilt. Dr. Elias arrived in record time, his expression serious upon seeing Ricardo's pale and distraught face. Without many words, Ricardo guided him to the isolated room. The doctor entered, and Ricardo waited in the corridor, anguish tightening his chest, each minute an eternity. When Dr. Elias finally emerged, his face was grim. "Ricardo, your father is severely dehydrated and malnourished. There are clear signs of severe neglect, wounds that haven't been properly treated. He needs immediate hospitalization for stabilization. And then, intensive and continuous care. It's a very delicate situation." The doctor's words were a direct hit, confirming Ricardo's greatest fears. His fury at Sofia, previously a contained simmer, now erupted like a volcano. He instructed Dr. Elias to arrange for the ambulance and hospitalization, ensuring his father received the best possible care. With his father on the way to the hospital, Ricardo felt a mixture of relief for having acted and a cold, calculating anger towards Sofia. She was at her lunch with the ladies of the club, a social event she would never miss. Ricardo knew exactly where to find her. He drove to the luxurious golf and tennis club, a stage of ostentation where Sofia felt at ease. Upon entering the main hall, he spotted her sitting at a table with other women, laughing, toasting with champagne glasses. The image of his father wasting away in the dark room contrasted brutally with the scene of opulence and carefree abandon. Sofia saw him, and her smile vanished, replaced by a confused expression. She stood up. "Ricardo, what are you doing here? Has something happened?" she asked, her voice still maintaining its usual sweetness, but Ricardo noticed an almost imperceptible tremor in her eyes. He approached her, ignoring the curious glances of the other women. His face was impassive, but his eyes burned with a chilling intensity. "Yes, Sofia, something has happened, something terrible. And it has to do with my father," he said, his voice low, but laden with a contained threat that silenced the other women, sensing the tension in the air. "Your father? But he's fine, darling. The nurse is with him," she began, trying to maintain her composure, but her voice failed. "There is no nurse, Sofia. There never was. And he is not fine. He is in the hospital, dehydrated, malnourished, with wounds, abandoned." Ricardo interrupted her, each word a blow. "I saw, Sofia. I saw the room. I saw what you did, or rather what you didn't do." Sofia's face paled. Her blue eyes, once calculating, now showed genuine terror. She tried to touch his arm, but Ricardo recoiled. "Ricardo, I can explain. He's so difficult. He didn't want to eat, didn't want to drink. He became aggressive." She stammered, the excuses flowing like water, desperate and empty. "Lies!" Ricardo hissed, his voice rising a tone, attracting even more attention. "The Parrot told me, Sofia. Lauro told me. She hid my cane. She didn't give me water. He was my father's voice, the voice I ignored because of you." Ricardo's words echoed through the hall, silencing the whispers completely. Sofia staggered back, her face white as paper. She knew she was lost. The mask of the perfect wife shattered, revealing the cruelty behind it. "You can't do this, Ricardo. I'm your wife. I took care of you, of the house." She tried to argue, but it was too late. "You didn't take care of anything, Sofia. You tortured him, and for that you will pay," Ricardo declared, his voice firm, unwavering. "You are out of my life, Sofia, forever, and justice will take care of the rest." He turned, leaving her there amidst shocked glances and whispers, the image of a woman unmasked, stripped of her pretense. The pain was immense, but Ricardo's resolve was even greater. He had a father to care for and a life to rebuild, free from Sophia's shadow. Ricardo left the golf club, leaving Sophia behind amidst the buzz of curious glances and shocked whispers. The cold afternoon air could not quell the fire burning in his chest. The fury was a cold flame, mixed with deep pain and overwhelming shame. He had been blind, a fool, and the price of his negligence was his father's suffering. There was no more room for hesitation. His resolve was clear and unwavering. Upon arriving home, the mansion seemed different, quieter, as if the very structure felt the weight of the events. Lauro was on his perch, observing him with his intelligent eyes. Ricardo felt a lump in his throat. The parrot, in its innocence, had been the voice of truth, the unexpected hero who tore through the veil of his complacency. "Thank you, Lauro," Ricardo whispered, his voice choked, and the parrot tilted its head, as if it understood. Ricardo immediately called his lawyer, Dr. Mendez, a man known for his integrity and efficiency. The conversation was brief, but laden with seriousness. "Doctor, I need you to initiate divorce proceedings and a legal action against Sophia for neglect and mistreatment of my father. I have irrefutable proof." Ricardo's voice was firm, without a trace of doubt. The lawyer, surprised by the gravity of the accusations, assured him he would act with the utmost urgency. Justice would be slow, but Ricardo was determined to see Sophia pay for every act of cruelty. Next, Ricardo went to the hospital. The atmosphere was one of tense calm, different from the empty opulence of his home. He found his father in a private room, connected to IVs and monitors. Dr. Elias was beside him with a worried expression. "He's stable, Ricardo, but the situation is delicate. The dehydration and malnutrition are severe. It will take time for him to recover." Ricardo sat beside the bed, holding his father's hand, which seemed even smaller and more fragile. His father's eyes were closed, and his breathing was soft but shallow. As he watched his father, a wave of memories flooded him. His strong father, laughing, teaching him to ride a bicycle, to solve complex problems. That man, now so vulnerable, depended on him. Guilt tightened its grip, but the determination to rectify his mistake was even greater. He caressed his father's wrinkled forehead, feeling the faint warmth of his skin. Suddenly, his father's eyes opened. There was none of the usual Alzheimer's confusion. There was a glimmer, a momentary clarity that made Ricardo's heart race. His father looked directly at him, and a weak, almost imperceptible smile appeared on his cracked lips. "Ricardo," he whispered, his voice a little more audible than before. You came." He squeezed Ricardo's hand with surprising strength for his condition. "I knew you would come." The words, so simple and direct, struck Ricardo like lightning. It wasn't just recognition, it was an affirmation of faith, of hope, coming from someone he thought was completely lost to the disease. Tears welled up again, but this time they were not just of guilt, but of deep love and a silent promise that he would never fail again. Dr. Elias, who was observing the scene, shook his head, moved. "It's a good sign, Ricardo. Family presence is a powerful medicine." His father closed his eyes again, the smile still faintly present. The clarity was gone as quickly as it came, but the impact on Ricardo was immense. That brief connection, that flicker of recognition and trust, was the turning point he needed. It wasn't just about justice for Sophia. It was about redemption, about rebuilding the bond with his father, about the love that should never have been forgotten. Ricardo knew the road would be long, but now he was certain he wouldn't be alone. He had his father, and he had Lauro, the faithful guardian of truth. Ricardo knew the road would be long, but the certainty of not being alone propelled him. He had his father, and Lauro, the faithful guardian of truth. That brief flicker of lucidity from his father ignited a flame of hope, a promise that love and dedication could reach the depths of Alzheimer's. He spent the night at the hospital by his father's side, observing every breath, as if wanting to compensate for years of absence. Dr. Elias, seeing his determination, assured him that his father was receiving the best treatment and that the son's constant and loving presence was a balm. The next day, with his father still under observation, Ricardo plunged into a frenzy of organization. Anna, his assistant, had already transformed one of the sunny and spacious rooms on the main floor into a sanctuary of comfort. Light curtains, soft and safe furniture, and a discreet monitoring system were installed to ensure security and privacy. Books from his youth, family photos, and a radio with classical music his father loved were carefully arranged, each item chosen to rekindle memories. It wasn't just a room, it was a home, a true refuge of affection and dignity. Meanwhile, Dr. Mendez, his lawyer, had already initiated legal proceedings. News of the lawsuit against Sofia, a well-known figure in high society, began to circulate, causing shock. Ricardo, oblivious to the whispers, focused on his father's recovery and the rebuilding of broken trust. He visited him several times a day at the hospital, reading and telling stories from his childhood without certainty of comprehension. He held the wrinkled hand, feeling life seemingly return, a faint thread of hope. After a week, Dr. Elias confirmed his father was stable enough to return home. Specialized nurses, selected by Anna, were on standby. The ambulance brought him back to the mansion, not to the dark, isolated room, but to the new space, bathed in light and affection. Ricardo waited, his heart heavy, as he watched his father being settled into the soft bed. The contrast with the desolate scene he had found was stark, a painful reminder of his failure and of his promise of care and love. Lauro, the parrot, seemed to sense the change in the air. Since Ricardo's return from the club, the bird had been calmer, its cries of anguish replaced by a soft song and, at times, a Ricardo, my son, that brought a bittersweet smile to Ricardo. With his father back, Lauro was moved to an area near the new room, where his presence would be felt without disturbing his rest. Ricardo watched his father fall asleep, his breathing regular, his face less tense. He sat in the armchair beside him, feeling a peace long unexperienced, a calm of the soul. It was not the peace of ignorance, but of action and assumed responsibility. He knew the journey would be long, but he was ready. True wealth, he understood, was there, in that room, in his father's fragility and unconditional love. The first days after his father's return to the mansion were of a palpable delicacy, woven with hope and guilt. Ricardo dedicated himself with surprising intensity. Each morning, before any commitment, he visited his father. He sat by the bed, held his wrinkled hand, and read excerpts from newspapers in a calm voice, even knowing his father's intermittent comprehension. He spoke about the garden, the weather, small joys, seeking to rekindle their connection. The attentive nurses guided Ricardo, teaching him to deal with the challenges of Alzheimer's with the patience and affection needed at every moment. His father, little by little, showed faint signs of improvement. The wounds healed, his skin regained color, and his eyes, though distant, sometimes fixed on Ricardo, with an indescribable glimmer of recognition. Small gestures, like a gentle squeeze of the hand or a weak smile upon hearing an old melody on the radio, became precious victories, a balm for Ricardo's wounded soul. He celebrated every moment, feeling the guilt diminish, replaced by growing hope and renewed purpose. He had failed, yes, but he was there, present, fighting to reverse the damage. Lauro, with his peculiar sensitivity, seemed to understand the new atmosphere. His shrill calls gave way to a softer song, and he frequently repeated, "Ricardo, my son," with a sweetness almost like a lullaby. The parrot, now positioned on a perch in the corridor leading to his father's room, was a constant reminder of the voice that revealed the truth, but also a symbol of the new phase of love and care. His presence was a link between the painful past and the present of redemption, a silent guardian of the newfound peace. As the mansion transformed into a home of healing and affection, the outside world reacted to Sophia's downfall. News of Ricardo's legal action against her reverberated through social circles that once idolized her. The shock and condemnation were palpable, and Sophia's once untouchable image crumbled. She, formerly the personification of elegance and success, was now seen as the embodiment of cruelty and falsehood, a shadow of her former self. Dr. Mendez, with his team, worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and testimonies, ensuring that justice, though slow, would be relentless. Ricardo, however, remained focused on his father, delegating legal matters to his lawyer, without allowing bitterness to distract him from his greater purpose. At night, when his father finally slept, cradled by the security of the new room, Ricardo sat in his library, not to work, but to reflect. The pile of business documents remained untouched, gathering dust. His thoughts were on his father, on the fragility of life, on the importance of time and unconditional love. He realized that true wealth was not in the figures of his fortune, but in shared moments, in hands held, in the smile that struggled to appear on his father's face. The mansion, once a symbol of his success and his blindness, was now the stage of his own transformation, of his personal redemption. He was learning to love again, to care, to be present in body and soul. The journey would be long, but each step was a rebirth for Ricardo. Ricardo now lived each day with a new and profound intensity. Mornings at the mansion began with the soft sunlight invading his father's room, and Ricardo was always there, punctual, with a glass of fresh water and a gentle smile. He helped the nurses prepare his father for breakfast, feeling strangely at ease with the care routine, something unthinkable just weeks ago. He spoke about the weather, about the garden flowers his father loved so much, or simply held his hand, conveying a presence that was medicine for the fragile soul. One morning, as Ricardo read an old storybook his father used to read to him in childhood, something magical happened. Ricardo was reading about a boy building a paper boat to sail in a puddle, and his father, in a weak voice, murmured, "Remember, the stream, our wooden boat." Ricardo stopped reading, his heart racing. It was a clear memory from the time they had carved a small boat together to release in the stream behind the country house. Tears welled up in Ricardo's eyes. "I remember, Father. I remember every detail," he said, his voice choked, squeezing his father's hand. That flicker of lucidity was a treasure, proof that love could, indeed, reach the deepest memories, even under the veil of Alzheimer's. His technological empire, once the center of his universe, now seemed distant, a faint echo of a life he barely recognized. Business calls were answered by Anna. Important emails received concise and direct replies. Ricardo had learned to delegate not out of convenience, but out of priority. No meeting or contract compared to his father's smile or that brief moment of clarity. The mansion, once a stage for his ambition, transformed into a sanctuary of affection, where every corner breathed a new peace. Lauro the parrot observed everything from his perch in the corridor. His calls were now almost always melodious, and he frequently repeated in a soft voice, "Father, Ricardo, love," words that blessed the new home. Meanwhile, the outside world continued to turn, but with a new focus. News about Sophia and Ricardo's legal action spread like wildfire, fueling conversations and headlines. The image of the impeccable socialite publicly crumbled, revealing the cruelty she had hidden so well. Ricardo, however, remained oblivious to the gossip, focused on his purpose. Justice would run its course, slow and relentless, but true reparation for him was happening there, in his father's room. With every small advance, every smile, every touch. He spent his evenings in the library, yes, but financial reports were replaced by books on elder care and Alzheimer's, by old photos he showed his father, narrating family stories. Guilt still visited him, a painful reminder of his failure, but it was eased by the certainty that he was doing everything in his power to heal the wounds. Ricardo was learning that the true measure of a man was not in his fortune, but in his capacity to love, protect, and redeem himself. The mansion, once a symbol of power and status, was now the silent testimony of a profound transformation, of a heart that had finally found its true home in the simplicity and strength of family ties. The days unfolded into a tapestry of dedication and rediscovery for Ricardo. Each dawn brought with it the certainty that the greatest wealth was not in his businesses, but in his father's sometimes lost eyes. He had become a pillar of care, a son who, after years of blindness, finally saw the invaluable worth of family love. The mansion's routine, once dictated by meetings and figures, was now guided by his father's mealtimes, gentle physiotherapy sessions, and moments of reading and quiet conversations. Ricardo felt lighter, despite the weight of his responsibilities. Guilt, though never entirely absent, transformed into a driving force for his dedication. He spent hours by his father's side, showing him old photo albums, narrating stories from his childhood and youth, searching for any spark of recognition. And these sparks, however faint, were his greatest treasure. One afternoon, while flipping through an album, Ricardo pointed to a faded photo of a family picnic. "Remember, father, that day it rained and we had to eat inside the car, but it was so much fun." His father, who until then had only observed with a vague gaze, suddenly smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his wrinkled face. "Your mother's apple pie," he murmured, his voice weak, but laden with a sweetness that made Ricardo's heart ache with emotion. It was a gift, a precious fragment of memory that Alzheimer's had not managed to completely erase. Lauro, the parrot, continued to be a constant and comforting presence. His perch, now in the living room, allowed him to observe the movement of the house, especially Ricardo's moments with his father. His calls were softer, and he frequently repeated, "Father, my love," as if echoing the feelings that filled the air. At times, Lauro imitated the song of a small bird, a sound Ricardo knew was his father's favorite, bringing serenity to the environment. The parrot was indeed the guardian of the new peace, the living reminder that truth, however painful, can lead to healing. As life in the mansion redefined itself, the outside world continued to judge Sophia. The legal process advanced, and newspaper headlines spared no details about the revealed negligence and cruelty. Her once impeccable image was in ruins, and the high society that once revered her now repudiated her. Ricardo received updates from Dr. Mendez, but he did not allow vengeance or bitterness to take hold of his heart. His energy was channeled into his father's recovery, into rebuilding a love he had almost lost. He had learned that true strength did not reside in the power of his businesses, but in the resilience of the human spirit and the capacity to love unconditionally. The mansion, once a stage for his ambition and hidden suffering, was now a sanctuary of hope, where every gesture of affection was a prayer, and every small advance of his father a celebration of life. Ricardo, the technology magnate, had transformed into a man who valued the intangible, the inestimable. The journey was long, but he walked it with a renewed purpose, guided by the light of a rediscovered love. The journey was long, but he walked it with a renewed purpose, guided by the light of a rediscovered love. Ricardo now not only cared, but lived for these moments, for every small spark of recognition in his father's eyes. The mansion, once a stage for his ambition, had transformed into a home of healing and affection. He had found a rhythm of dedication. Mornings began with the soft sunlight invading his father's room, and Ricardo was always there, punctual, with fresh water and a gentle smile. He helped the nurses, feeling at ease with the care routine, something unthinkable weeks ago. He spoke about the garden, the flowers his father loved so much, or simply held his hand, conveying a presence that was medicine for the fragile soul. His father's small advances were the oxygen that fueled Ricardo's hope. The physical wounds had healed, and the glimmer in his eyes, though distant, appeared more frequently, especially when Ricardo read. One afternoon, flipping through an album, Ricardo pointed to a faded image of a picnic. "Remember, father? That day it rained and we had to eat inside the car, but it was so much fun." His father, who until then had only observed with a vague gaze, suddenly smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his wrinkled face. "Your mother's apple pie," he murmured, his voice weak, but laden with a sweetness that made Ricardo's heart ache. It was a gift, a precious fragment of memory that Alzheimer's had not managed to erase. Loro, the parrot, continued to be a constant and comforting presence. His perch, now in the living room, allowed him to observe the movement of the house, especially Ricardo's moments with his father. His calls were softer, and he frequently repeated, "Father, my love," as if echoing the feelings that filled the air. At times, Loro imitated the song of a small bird, a sound Ricardo knew was his father's favorite, bringing serenity to the environment. The parrot was, indeed, the guardian of the new peace, the living reminder that truth, however painful, can lead to healing. As life in the mansion redefined itself, the outside world continued to judge Sophia. The legal process advanced, and newspaper headlines spared no details about the revealed negligence and cruelty. Her once impeccable image was in ruins, and the high society that once revered her now repudiated her. Ricardo received updates from Dr. Mendez, but he did not allow vengeance or bitterness to take hold of his heart. His energy was channeled into his father's recovery, into rebuilding a love he had almost lost. He had learned that true strength did not reside in the power of his businesses, but in the resilience of the human spirit and the capacity to love unconditionally. Ricardo realized that each day was a chance to reconnect. He brought an old record player into his father's room, putting on the jazz vinyls his father loved. The soft melody filled the air, and Ricardo watched his father, who sometimes swayed his head to the rhythm. On a sunny afternoon, as Miles Davis's Blue in Green played, Ricardo held his father's hand, warmer and firmer. His father opened his eyes, and this time the fog of forgetfulness had dissipated. There was a profound clarity, a look Ricardo hadn't seen in years. "My son," his father murmured, his voice surprisingly clear, though weak. He squeezed Ricardo's hand tightly, making the son's heart race. You came back to me." The words, laden with emotion and silent forgiveness, struck Ricardo like lightning. Tears streamed down his face, not of sadness, but of overwhelming joy, of a relief that washed over his soul. His father, with effort, touched Ricardo's face, a gesture of pure affection. "I love you, my son, always have." In that instant, time stopped. Only that touch, those words remained. Irrefutable proof that love and dedication could break through the barriers of illness. It was the climax of his redemption, the lost connection fully restored, a miracle of affection and overcoming. That instant of pure connection, his father's gentle touch on Ricardo's face and the words of unconditional love, reverberated in the magnate's soul like a hymn of redemption. The fog of guilt that had enveloped him for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a crystalline clarity about what truly mattered. It was not an end, but a new beginning, a solid foundation upon which Ricardo would rebuild his life and his father's. In the days that followed, Ricardo's father, though still fragile and with the disease progressing at its own pace, maintained a remarkable serenity. Those moments of full lucidity became rarer, like precious jewels appearing unexpectedly, but Ricardo's constant and loving presence, the dedicated care of the nurses, and the atmosphere of affection that filled the mansion ensured his comfort and dignity. Ricardo spent hours with him, reading, singing old songs, or simply holding his hand, feeling the pulse of life, a constant reminder that love was the most powerful of forces. He had learned to celebrate every small smile, every look of recognition, every moment of peace on his father's wrinkled face. As life in the mansion blossomed into a garden of affection, the outside world finally saw justice served. The legal process against Sofia reached its conclusion. Dr. Mendez, with his unquestionable competence, presented irrefutable evidence. The testimonies of nurses who had worked in the house before Ricardo's arrival, medical records attesting to malnutrition and neglect, and crucially, Lauro's indirect testimony, whose recordings of his father's phrases, though not direct legal proof, reinforced the narrative of cruelty. Sofia, with no way out, was convicted of neglect and elder abuse. The penalty, though not involving imprisonment, resulted in a heavy fine, the loss of all assets acquired during her marriage to Ricardo, and an indelible stain on her reputation. The society that once idolized her now viewed her with contempt, and she found herself completely isolated, paying the price for her cruelty and falsehood. Ricardo felt no joy in Sofia's downfall, but a deep sense of relief and justice served. He had ensured that his father's voice, silenced by illness, was heard and avenged. Lauro, the parrot, continued to be the pulsating heart of the mansion. His perch was moved to a central location in the living room, from where he could observe Ricardo and his father. His cries of anguish had completely disappeared, replaced by soft melodies and affectionate phrases. "Father, Ricardo, love," echoed through the rooms, a constant reminder of the truth he revealed and the love he helped restore. He was more than a pet. He was a family member, the guardian of memory and the new peace. The mansion, once a stage for ambition and hidden suffering, had transformed into a true home. The corridors that once seemed to echo loneliness now resonated with soft laughter, with the melody of jazz, and with the affectionate voices of Ricardo and the caregivers. His father's presence, once a delegated burden, was now the anchor that kept Ricardo firmly connected to his humanity. He had learned the most valuable lesson of his life. True wealth was not in the figures of his fortune, but in protection, unconditional love, and dedicated presence to his family. Blind trust, yes, had come at a devastating price, but the rediscovery of love and responsibility had forged a stronger, wiser, and infinitely richer man in spirit. Ricardo, the technology magnate, had found his truest purpose in the simplicity and strength of family ties, and each day was a celebration of this rediscovery, of his journey of redemption. Ricardo's journey of redemption unfolded into a serene present and a promising future, where each day was a testament to the power of love and the human capacity for transformation. The mansion, once an echo of his ambition and blindness, had become a safe harbor, a home where his father's presence was the sun that illuminated every corner. Ricardo was not merely fulfilling a duty. He was living a vocation, finding in the simplicity of daily care a richness that years of financial success had never provided him. His father, though his memory continued to fade in unpredictable waves, now lived in a state of peace and dignity. The physical wounds had disappeared, and his eyes, sometimes distant, other times filled with a familiar glimmer, reflected the affection that surrounded him. Ricardo continued to read to him, play his favorite music, and share stories, not expecting a perfect response, but valuing every sigh, every gentle squeeze of the hand as an invaluable treasure. He had learned that love did not demand full reciprocity, but rather presence and unconditional dedication. Loro, the parrot, maintained his place of honor in the living room, a winged guardian of the new atmosphere. His shrill calls were now a distant memory. In their place, a soft song was heard, almost a lullaby, and his phrases were always of affection. "Father, Ricardo, love," he repeated, with a sweetness that seemed to bless the environment. Loro was no longer just the messenger of painful truth. He was the living symbol of healing, the reminder that the voice of the most vulnerable deserves to be heard and protected. The outside world, with its judgments and headlines about Sofia, had become a distant noise for Ricardo. Justice had been served, and Sofia faced the consequences of her actions, isolated and stripped of her former glory. Ricardo felt no triumph, but a deep sense of peace for having ensured that truth prevailed. His energy, once dispersed in technological empires, was now concentrated on building a legacy of love and care. He had restructured his company, delegating wisely, ensuring that his most precious time was dedicated to his father and to social causes that supported the elderly and vulnerable people. Ricardo understood that the true measure of his life was not in financial balances, but in the depth of his human connections. The mansion, with its flowering gardens and rooms full of light and music, was now a sanctuary of affection, a home where the past of neglect had been washed away by the current of a rediscovered love. He had become a more compassionate, more present, more human man. And so Ricardo, the technology magnate, concluded his most important journey. It was not a journey to conquer fortunes or empires, but to rescue his own soul and his father's heart. He had learned that true wealth was not counted in figures, but in touches, in smiles, in moments of pure and unconditional family connection. Blind trust had indeed come at a high cost, but the lesson learned was of invaluable worth, a treasure he would carry forever in his heart. Life, with its pains and joys, had taught him the most beautiful of songs, the melody of love that heals, redeems, and transforms. The melody of love, rediscovered and meticulously cultivated, continued to resonate through the mansion's grand halls, now a sanctuary of renewed memories and hopes. Ricardo, the man who once prioritized his technological empire, had transformed. His days were no longer dictated by spreadsheets, but by the gentle rhythms of care, by his father's fleeting smiles, and by the profound peace that dwelled in his heart. Guilt, once a shadow, metamorphosed into a driving force for compassion and unconditional dedication. Ricardo's father, though Alzheimer's continued its relentless progression, lived with dignity and affection. His eyes, sometimes distant, other times surprisingly clear, found a safe harbor in Ricardo's. Mornings were filled with reading, with the jazz melody Ricardo played, and with quiet conversations about the garden. Ricardo had learned the art of being present, of valuing every moment, every sigh, every gentle touch. He knew that time was a precious gift, and he dedicated it entirely to the man who had given him life. Loro, the parrot, was more than a pet. He was the silent guardian of that new era of affection. His perch, strategically positioned in the living room, allowed him to observe the tender interaction between father and son. His cries of anguish were now a distant memory, replaced by soft melodies and phrases of pure affection. Father, Ricardo, love, he repeated with a sweetness that blessed every corner of the house. Lauro was the echoing voice of truth, the living reminder that compassion and vigilance were essential. He had fulfilled his heroic role, and now he was a living symbol of restored harmony and peace. The mansion, once a stage for intrigues and hidden suffering, radiated a new and vibrant light. The gardens, which Sofia had neglected, now flourished under Ricardo's attentive care, who found calming therapy in gardening. He had transformed one of the rooms into an occupational therapy space for his father, with memory games and objects that stimulated the senses. Every detail was thoughtfully considered to provide maximum comfort and well-being. Ricardo's technological empire prospered with a new humanitarian philosophy. Anna, his assistant, managed daily operations, delegating wisely. Ricardo's focus was on assistive technology for the elderly, investing in research to improve the quality of life for people like his father. It was his personal and professional redemption, using fortune and intelligence for a greater, lasting good. News about Sofia had cooled, becoming a distant echo. Justice had run its course, and she faced the consequences in isolation. Ricardo felt no anger, but resigned sadness. His energy was directed towards the present and towards building a future where love and dignity were non-negotiable. Ricardo, the magnate who lost himself in the pursuit of power, had found true wealth in his father's smile, in a fragile touch, in Lauro's melody. He had become a complete man, a dedicated son, an example that redemption is possible and family love is the most valuable treasure. The mansion, with its flowering gardens and rooms full of light and music, was the silent testimony of a transformed life, of a heart that had finally found its true purpose. And Lauro, from his perch, watched, eternal guardian of the truth and love that against all odds had prevailed.